treated properly when it landed there. Well, without going on, there's a pretty well established generalization. The greater the U.S. military involvement and control, the greater the poverty and misery. It's a pretty close correlation. A few things in history work out this clearly. And the poverty and misery is quite severe. Haiti and Nicaragua may be literally uninhabitable in another generation or two. El Salvador, which is another leading target of U.S. terror, especially in the 80s, that's not very far behind. Well, these things, they take a considerable effort to ignore, I think, and particularly because they generalize. So in Asia, there's one country that's a basket case, was an except stayed out of the, wasn't part of the Asian economic miracle of the last 20 or 30 years, namely the Philippines, which was conquered by the United States 100 years ago, killing several 100,000 people, stayed a U.S. colony for half a century and a neo-colony ever since. Again, continues to the present. There are other correlations that are, again, kind of tricky to ignore. It takes a little effort, I suppose. One of them is that there's a very well-established correlation, which you can read in the mainstream scholarly literature, in fact, between U.S. aid, including U.S. military aid, and torture and state terror. They correlate very closely. Actually, these studies were done in 1980. Nobody bothered to do them during the 1980s because the results were too obvious. You don't do experiments to show that 2 + 2 = 4. It continues through the 90s, very dramatically, in fact. The leading human rights violator in the hemisphere through the 90s by a considerable margin is Colombia. It's also been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training right through the 1990s. In fact, about half of the military aid and training in the hemisphere. So the correlation continues. In 1999, Colombia actually took first place in the world as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Notice I'm omitting here Israel and Egypt, which are in a separate category. But outside of them, Colombia took first place. It replaced Turkey, which had previously been the leader for some years, except for a brief period when El Salvador took first place during the period of the most intense state terrorist attack, basically U.S. attack against the population. But Turkey had for a while been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, replaced by Colombia in 1999. Well, why Turkey? Turkey is a strategic ally. It's next to Russia, next to the Middle East. So it had always gotten substantial military aid. It was kind of level into the early 80s. In 1984, the military aid shot up. Notice that had absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War, transparently. What it had to do with is the fact that in 1984, Turkey launched a counterinsurgency campaign against its miserably oppressed Kurdish population. And that required military aid, and the United States was happy to provide it in the interest of human rights and freedom and justice. And the aid stayed very high. As I say, Turkey was first place, though replaced for a while by El Salvador, stayed very high until 1999. The main atrocities were in the Clinton years, and that's when the aid went up as well. As the atrocities escalated, so did the military aid. Clinton administration was providing 80% of Turkey's arms. The peak year was 1997. In fact, in the single year 1997, the United States provided more military aid to Turkey than in the entire period, 1950 to 1983. The entire Cold War period was outweighed in the single year of 1997. And the results were impressive. 2 to 3 million refugees, 3,500 or so villages and towns wiped out, tens of thousands of people killed. Actually, nobody really knows the details. Since it's our crimes, nobody investigates, and it's rarely reported, very rarely, in fact, usually denied. The fact, however, is that this is one of the most extreme examples of atrocities and ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, right through to the late 1990s. Recall that this is within NATO. It's not across its borders where we're supposed to be very upset about crimes. By 1999, the Clinton-backed atrocities and ethnic cleansing had succeeded. The Kurdish insurgency had been crushed. The Colombian insurgency, however, had not yet been crushed. Correspondingly, and if you're rational, perhaps, therefore, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Well, these again are things you're just not supposed to notice because they conform too well to the moral truism. They tell you too much about our institutions and how they function, and about the intellectual culture that protects and supports them, our culture, which we take part in, contribute to, and sustain. It's not something out there somewhere. The same issue of the New York Times on Sunday also has a book review by a well-known liberal historian about several new books about Vietnam. That's appropriate. We're now approaching the 40th anniversary of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam. Remember that South Vietnam was always the major target of the U.S. attack. Of course, the U.S. said it was there to defend the government of South Vietnam from terrorists from abroad, essentially what the Russians said about their invasion of Afghanistan, and with maybe about half as much legitimacy. But we're supposed to believe it, so therefore that's the line. Anyhow, we're coming up to 40 years. It's 1961 and 62 is when Kennedy launched the direct attack against South Vietnam. That's after about 6 years of U.S. running a Latin American-style terror state there, in which about 60,000 to 70,000 people were killed, eliciting resistance which couldn't be controlled, so the U.S. invaded directly. The results I don't have to go through. You should know them. It's maybe worth mentioning that in a poll a couple of years, I think it's the only poll I know of, where Americans were asked to estimate the number of Vietnamese dead in the war. The average guess was about 100,000. If there was a poll in Germany which revealed that Germans estimated the number of Holocaust victims at 200,000, we might think there's a little bit of a problem in German culture that should perhaps be looked at. But since this is our massacres and atrocities, the question doesn't arise. And it doesn't arise in the review or in the books. The review and the books never suggest that there's anything wrong about anything we did. The only problem is, was it a failure? Why was it a failure? You know, who's responsible, and so on. The kind of questions that the German General Staff would have been raising after Stalingrad, I suppose. That's pretty typical. Just to mention another current case, there was a couple of weeks ago a meeting in Havana, which you probably read about in the paper. It was a meeting of Kennedy advisors and Bay of Pigs veterans meeting with Cubans to go over what happened at the Bay of Pigs invasion. The reports were quite interesting. They also never hinted that there might be something wrong with invading another country. It's always a question of why it failed and that sort of thing. A friend of mine is a Latin American correspondent who actually reported the invasion from Cuba back then. He attended, and I asked him. He told me that at the discussions that question was never raised. Just not an issue. You don't raise that kind of question. Just recently, the State Department released about 1,000 pages of documents on the missile crisis, 1962. A good part of the documents deal with the terror operations that Kennedy organized. Kennedy was a super hawk and deeply committed to massive terror. Cuba was one of the victims. Colombia was another, incidentally. And a lot of this deals with the terror. It wasn't jokes either. It was serious stuff, killings, blowing up installations, blowing up hotels, all sorts of things. There was a review of all of this in Diplomatic History, which is the main serious professional journal. Several reviews, several scholars wrote reviews of 1,000 pages. One of them, Jorge Dominguez at Harvard, pointed out in his review, he went through the material, but he pointed out an interesting fact, a fact that he felt that was interesting, namely in 1,000 pages of documents on Operation Mongoose and other terrorist operations, he was only able to find one phrase in 1,000 pages that suggested, of these internal discussions and planning and stuff, one phrase that suggested that there may be some problem with this. It was a staffer for the National Security Council who wanted to raise the possibility that if any of these atrocities became public, it might harm the U.S. image in Europe, and therefore didn't care much about Latin America, but might harm it in Europe. And therefore maybe we should have some second thoughts, or at least keep them more quiet. Remember who these people were. These were the intellectual elite from Harvard, MIT, and places like that. And it's an interesting reflection on the moral and cultural institutions. That's just from current things. It's very easy to find more if you go back. Well, let's go back to the New York Times review, the think piece on how others should face crimes. It opens with the trial of Milosevic right now. And in fact, that's the main theme. The main theme is Serb crimes. The writer points out correctly that the war crimes trial, the International War Crimes Trial, is only for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. He didn't ask why that limit was imposed. It's an interesting question, but let's put it aside. Actually, it's not quite accurate either. It's not for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. It's for his crimes after March 24th, 1999. If you read the indictment, you find that virtually every crime mentioned that's the day when the U.S.-NATO bombing began. Virtually everything mentioned is some crime that took place after the bombing. There are reasons for that time frame as well, carefully evaded in the huge literature that's come out about this topic. Come back to it if you like, but I'll skip it now. Anyway, it's a fact. Virtually nothing in the indictment, few things, but very little before the bombing. So the war crimes trials are in fact for crimes within a very specific time frame, namely the crime, and they're real crimes, no doubt about that, the crimes committed under NATO bombing. The crimes that were incidentally anticipated and not very surprising, doesn't change the fact that they're crimes. Well, without proceeding with that, I'll mention that there's another trial going on right now. It's not in Belgrade or in The Hague, but in Washington. This is the trial of General Johnny Lumintang. He's an Indonesian general who was implicated in planning and executing massive crimes in East Timor in 1999, far beyond anything attributed to Milosevic, I should say. Furthermore, not only are these much worse in character, they also happen to be war crimes, not just crimes against humanity, that is, crimes in the course of aggression, the most serious kind. Furthermore, these crimes were not carried out under bombing by a superpower. In fact, not even under any fighting. There was nothing going on, just plain massive attacks on the civilian population. There was a superpower involved, actually two, the United States and Britain. They had been involved for a long time, 25 years in fact. They were involved in arming and training the killers. That continued right through 1999. In earlier years, their involvement actually was genocidal, one of the places where that overused word really applies. Relative to the population, the deaths, killings were probably greater than anything since the Holocaust. And that continued through 1999. The U.S.-British client destroyed about 70% of the country, drove out 85% of the population, killed nobody knows how many people, and nobody ever will know for a very good reason. The United States prevented the dispatch of any forensic experts, quite different from Kosovo, where the place was flooded by forensic experts to try to dig out crimes of the official enemy, but here they were withheld despite pleas from the UN and Australia. Furthermore, the U.S. has blocked any tribunal, so there'll never be an investigation. But there is a trial going on, Lumintang's trial. Lumintang was served court papers in Washington on March 27th. He was in Washington at the invitation of the State Department. He's one of their favorites. The State Department was pretty upset by the fact that he was handed a subpoena, and the U.S. apologized profusely to the government of Indonesia for this indignity. He was quickly spirited out of the country, but the trial is proceeding in absentia and in silence. There hasn't been a word about it. Good reasons. Unlike Milosevic, under NATO bombing, Lumintang is a U.S.-run criminal responsible for much worse crimes. So therefore, his trial, right in Washington, not very easy to ignore, has to be ignored by the usual principles. Well, of course, it could be argued that Lumintang is not the top commander, which is correct. He's greatly implicated. He was not the top commander. The top commander was General Wiranto. He was granted an amnesty in advance, just in case there ever might be a tribunal, not that there's much threat of that. The top leaders are, of course, exempt. And the decisive role of the United States and Britain, that's also exempt. And it is decisive, right back through the Ford and particularly Carter years. In fact, the role of the United States is virtually entirely suppressed in the United States, has been all along, still is. In Britain, not so completely. Britain is not is a less disciplined society than us, not just in this respect. Even worse than that, the current story that's now around, and that will enter history, of course, is that the U.S. led the humanitarian intervention in East Timor because it was so appalled by the crimes, which in fact it was carrying out. And this was after it had unfortunately overlooked the crimes of the past 25 years over which it was presiding and for which it provided the crucial military and diplomatic support, with about a third of the population wiped out, all thanks to the complicity of the media and the intellectual culture generally, folks like us, people who are always very agitated about the other guy's crimes. Well, these are near historical universals. It's all too easy to continue this shameful story. Just keeping to the Sunday New York Times, which incidentally I haven't exhausted. I've just sampled. I could go on for another hour on that, but I won't. And I should say that the U.S. and Britain are by no means unusual, and as I said before, this is pretty standard. The main difference between the United States and Britain and other societies is that the United States and Britain have never been defeated. And furthermore, they have been dominant societies. And for those reasons alone, they have nothing to regret. It follows that if you're not defeated and you're in a dominant position, you didn't do anything wrong. That's kind of like a principle of logic. Therefore, you have nothing to regret. And in fact, you can bask in self-adulation for your courageous leadership in the cause of human rights and freedom and so on. And it's essentially the task of the intellectual community to make sure that this all works very smoothly. And it does. There's rarely a hitch. Well, I should say, and for accuracy, that there sometimes is a hitch. So the charge is not totally accurate. Our country, the United States, as you know, was founded and developed, in fact, on the basis of terrible crimes, slavery and the most extreme ethnic cleansing in history, I suppose. And there have been occasional statements of regret, never any official statements. One of the rare examples, and they are very rare in high places, is John Quincy Adams. He was a major contributor to massive crimes. And long after his involvement in that, long after he was out of office, Adams deplored, I'm quoting, "the heinous sins for which I believe God will one day bring this nation to judgment." He hoped that this belated stand would somehow aid that hapless race of Native Americans that we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. He hoped in vain, of course. The attack escalated very quickly and continued until the dispossession and the extermination were almost complete, leaving us miraculously guiltless in the eyes of the history that we construct. Actually, how guiltless we are, you can test from your own recent experience. You're all beneficiaries of a good education. I'm sure that, like most people, you were paying a lot of attention last November to stories coming from a county in Florida. The date line was Seminole County, Florida. That was the scene of various electoral shenanigans. You can now carry out an experiment. You can ask yourselves how you would have reacted if there was an election in Germany now and everyone was focusing their eyes on electoral shenanigans in, say, Kike County, Bavaria. If you can imagine that, you're looking in the mirror. You might, if you don't know why, you ought to find out why. That's back to John Quincy Adams, in fact. Let's go back to the... all of these are just among the prerequisites of power. Powerful, you're allowed to do these things. These are illustrations of the truisms that I mentioned. Let's look at the question a little bit more generally, back off a little. Actually, the question has been addressed at a very question of whether this will lead to self-destruction. I'm now giving an interpretation of an article that didn't interpret what he said the way I do, but I think it applies. The general question was addressed by the grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr of Harvard. He wrote an article a couple of years ago on the adaptive value of higher intelligence, and he was pretty skeptical about it. His reasons were that he said we've had about 50 billion species since the origin of life, only one of which achieved the intelligence needed to establish a civilization. It did so very recently in a very small breeding group from which we're all descended. Probably were lots of other close relatives, but they're gone, probably exterminated, along with big mammals. Anyhow, that's what's left, and that's the one exception. He concludes, Mayr, that this kind of evolutionary accident is not favored by selection. The history of life on Earth, he says, refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than stupid. The successful organisms are stupid. They are adapted to very narrow ecological niches. Beetles, bacteria, actually phage, which are in mass, I suppose, the most successful. Capacity for rapid mutation helps. Mayr adds the rather somber observation that the average life expectancy of the species on Earth is about 100,000 years. It's just about the lifespan of the one species that most radically broke the pattern. And now faces the question of whether it's better to be smart than stupid. That's the question I'm asking. The species is certainly smart enough to have developed the capacity to destroy itself, no doubt about that. And it's also demonstrated that capacity quite consistently throughout history, quite dramatically so in the past several hundred years, with an assault on the environment that sustains life, on the diversity of more complex organisms, and on each other as well. Just the last century, there were about 100 million deaths which are directly attributable to war. The last decade, contrary to what's often said, brought nothing new. The consequences of the collapse of the British and the French and the Portuguese empires were far more destructive than what followed the collapse of the East European tyrannies And in fact, those still remain very prominently on the front pages today, decades later. That's contrary to what's commonly claimed, but that takes us back to the truisms I mentioned earlier. Many of the conflicts of the past decade can be attributed to an enemy empire that collapsed, leaving a terrible legacy, namely the Soviet Union. So therefore, those atrocities are real, as distinct from the legacy of our friends and allies, which is incomparably worse, but not real, by virtue of the historical truism that of immunity of power and privilege from inspection. Even though the 90s were not unusual, and in fact less destructive than the collapse of earlier empires, Western empires, and even though the number of interstate conflicts has declined quite sharply through the 90s, nevertheless it wasn't a pretty decade. By 1998, internal to state, interstate conflicts had left about 5 million dead, 10 million refugees, 5 million people internally displaced. 40% of those are in Colombia, where the regular increase, about 300,000 a year, of the past decade is expected to accelerate pretty sharply as Washington's war moves into full gear. It's Clinton's planned Colombia. And that's in addition to over 1 million who just fled the country. More ominously still, the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization to which Ernst Mayr referred, it has constructed particular kinds of dominant civilizations, and they are based on institutional structures that do increase the likelihood of dreadful outcomes. The most obvious example is just the international system, which is designed in such a way, structured in such a way that it tends to enhance an apparently inexorable drive to adapt modern technology to the most destructive ends. Nuclear weapons are the most threatening example, and in deference to the principle of looking at ourselves, we might attend to our own the situation right here. The primacy assigned to nuclear weapons in the highest level strategic planning of the Clinton years. And there's a reason, so quoting from documents of the Strategic Command, highest level planning group. They say, unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few or any palliatives to reduce its effect. So therefore, the planners recommend that nuclear weapons be visibly available, because although we are not likely to use nuclear weapons in less than matters of the greatest national importance, which is reassuring, I suppose, nevertheless they cast a shadow over every crisis or conflict. Furthermore, it's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements of government may appear to be potentially out of control. That the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be a part of the national persona we project. That's what's called credibility in public discourse. And it's projected. The world is very frightened, including Europe. The U.S. must therefore reject the basic principle of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely that nuclear powers make a good faith effort to eliminate nuclear weapons, and the U.S. must retain them as the basis for our strategic posture. That includes the right of first use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear powers which have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's all very explicit. In any country that valued its freedom, this would be all over the front pages and would have been for years since it's been declassified. The basic conclusions have been approved in presidential directives, Clinton directives. They authorize first use, and they maintain nuclear weapons in launch on warning posture that perpetuates a high alert regime of the past years with the ever-present danger to survival. There are new programs that are being initiated to implement these decisions. There is a change in the post-Cold War period. So the Pentagon, its own internal documents, right after the Cold War ended, recommended and has implemented a change from targeting primarily what it called the weapons-rich environment of the Soviet Union to the target-rich environment of the rest of the world, the third world, which has actually been the main target of U.S. military action right throughout the Cold War and is remaining so, apart from some modification of pretexts that the Cold War required. Its major change since the end of the Cold War is change of pretexts and elimination of a deterrent to U.S. violence. And it's even made pretty explicit. More evidence that it may not be better to be smart than stupid is the National Missile Defense Program. There's a standard criticism of this, namely that it would be useless, since there are easy modes of delivery that don't require missiles. Graham Allison, who's leading strategic analyst over at the Harvard Kennedy School, pointed out that if terrorists wanted to smuggle a nuclear warhead into New York City, all they'd have to do is wrap it in a bale of marijuana. Another common argument is that they won't work. That's the standard criticism. It's not going to work. A much more dangerous possibility is that it might work, or that it might even appear to be working. Remember that in issues of survival, like nuclear strategy, appearance has got to be interpreted as reality. Can't take any chances. So if there's any possibility that it might work, it's extremely dangerous. As long as it's not going to work, it's just a waste of, it's just a way to fund high-tech industry. If it looks as if it might work, however, then it's really dangerous. And U.S. intelligence estimates have been pretty clear about this. They've predicted that the deployment of a national missile defense that looks feasible is, I'm quoting now, is going to impel China to develop new nuclear-armed missiles, expanding its nuclear arsenal by a factor of 10, prompting India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups, with a likely ripple effect to the Middle East. These same analyses, and plenty of others, point out that the Russians' only rational response would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. U.S. negotiators, Clinton-era negotiators, in fact encouraged Russia to adopt a launch-on-warning strategy themselves. The idea was to alleviate Russian concerns and to induce them to accept the national missile defense and the revision of the ABM treaty. That's a proposal that's pretty bizarre, one expert commented, because we know their warning system is full of holes, so it simply maximizes the threat to us and everyone else. There was a UN conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty last May. It was very broad, in fact, universal condemnation of the national missile defense on grounds that it would undermine decades of arms control agreements, provoke a new weapons race, but both political parties in the United States are committed to it, though at different rates. Very few, including allies, pay much attention to the tales about rogue states. Canadian military planners, for example, advised the government that the goal of national missile defense is more to preserve U.S. NATO freedom of action than because the United States really fears North Korean or Iranian threats. It's declassified briefings. The reasons commonly given for this are the pressure of military industry and so on, which could be. I suspect myself, and I don't prove it, that a non-trivial factor in this may be traced back again to cultural patterns. In particular, a kind of a curious paranoid streak in American culture, which may well be the result of centuries of victories against much weaker enemies, facing no military threat since the War of 1812. So the bully in the schoolyard may well come to fear that everyone hates him for some reason. As compared with other countries, there are remarkably high levels of fear in the United States. That's of all sorts of things. Crime, terrorism, aliens among us, Judgment Day, just about anything you can think of except for the real threats to the United States and the world, which are high and probably increasing. Now that would be something of a problem if we were talking about Afghanistan. But we're not. It's vastly more significant when we're talking about the most advanced civilization that intelligence has been able to create and the most dominant. Well, these global concerns are not alleviated by other U.S. stands. Last November 1999, the United States blocked the UN General Assembly resolution opposing space-based weapons. It was passed 138 to 0, the U.S. and Israel alone abstaining, but a U.S. abstention is a veto. 2 years earlier, the U.S. Space Command published what it called its vision for the year 2020, which called for what they call full spectrum dominance, including control of space, military control, in order to protect U.S. interests and investments. Well, there are plenty of threats in the world, but the major problems lie right at home and hence are within the sphere of our influence and control, which brings us right back to the truisms that I mentioned at the outset. Well, again, a lot more to say about this, but let's turn to another domain. So consider something nice and mild, not nuclear weapons, neoclassical markets. Markets in which isolated individuals seek only to maximize a particular form of self-interest, and certainly a form that's consciously constructed with very great effort, with perceptions instituted by vast industries that are devoted to implanting and reinforcing them. In the United States, about 1/6 of gross domestic product, that's well over $1 trillion a year, is devoted to marketing. Much of it is just manipulation and control, trying to institute these values, starting at infancy. Well, these constructed systems have a number of well-known problems. One is that unborn generations who are going to face the consequences have no vote in the market, from which it follows that their interests count as zero in the market system. They don't enter into consideration in a well-functioning market. That alone tends to undermine the possibilities of the sustainable development on which survival relies. These threats are currently being enhanced very consciously by dedicated efforts to weaken the institutional structures that might address these externalities, as they're called. And even more important, to undermine the culture of sympathy and solidarity that sustains them. Now, this last commitment, I think, is pretty important. I believe it's the driving force behind the propaganda efforts that are designed to undermine popular support for healthcare systems of the kind that are found in other industrial societies, and to create a largely artificial sense of crisis about the schools and Social Security, and in fact about any institutions that rely on the dangerous sentiment that we might care about somebody else, not just ourselves. The Social Security scam has other roots, and it's a scam. Take a look if you don't believe it. Whatever one thinks about transferring Social Security to stocks, the stock market, there are two consequences which are absolutely clear and undebatable. One is that it's a huge bonanza for Wall Street. Another is that it entails that working people are going to end up with a tremendous stake in the value of stocks, the stocks on which their survival, post-retirement survival, depends, and the survival of their families. That means that working people will have a strong reason to oppose decent wages and working conditions, health and safety standards in the workplace, the social and economic rights that are given formal endorsement in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but which the U.S. strongly opposes, and other principles that are naturally despised by the unaccountable private tyrannies that dominate the domestic and the international society in close alliance with one another and the powerful states that they largely dominate. That's another prescription for disaster, and not so in such a long term. Well, it's commonly claimed that there's a huge payoff for these problems, what's called globalization or the new economy or free markets or other terms of propaganda, I believe, referring to the social and economic policies of the past 20-odd years. According to the story, they have led to unprecedented economic growth, though unfortunately a few have been left behind and we have to do something about that, all led by the spectacular fairy tale economy of the United States. You've read this 1,000 times. So take, say, the most critical voice in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, on March 10th. He informed us that, I'm quoting, "the great